Okay, so welcome everyone to Parshat Toldot. This week is a big parsha. I guess they're all kind of big, but this one features the blessing and the deception, wherein Isaac blesses Jacob, thinking that he is Esau because his mother Rivka, that is Jacob's mother, Rivka, has deployed him to trick his father. And so what we are going to consider today is kind of the nature of that blessing. And in particular, one of the small ways that the blessings are distinct, the blessing as given to Jacob and the blessing that's given to Esau. So I'm going to share my screen. This is very exciting, everyone. Here we are. I'm controlling it this time. Okay, so I'm going to start here on source number 2. Source number 2 is after, let me say it differently. Jacob is here receiving a blessing from his father. And the words are, Vayitein lecha Elokim mital hashamayim umishmanei haaretz v'rov dagan v'tirosh. And may God give you of the dew of the heaven and the fat of the earth, abundance of new grain and wine. And I'm going to just, bear with me, scroll down to the bottom here. This, after it is revealed that the blessing has been stolen, Esau is really upset. And he says to his father, Vayomer Esav el aviv habracha achat hi lecha avi. Do you only have one blessing? Gamani avi. I also want one. Vaisa Esav kolo vayefk. And he wailed. He raised his voice and he wailed. Vayaan Yitzchak avi vayomer elav. Hine mishmanei haaretz yihye moshavecha umital hashamayim me'al. And his father responds, behold. Let's see how the translation is. I'm doing this off the top of my head, but here's the translation. Your abode shall enjoy the fat of the earth and the dew of the heaven above. I hope that indicates to you, or that sounds familiar to you, because it is not all that different from what was said a moment ago, right? So, Hine mishmanei haaretz yeh moshavecha. Behold, the fat of the land will be your lot, or something like that. Versus the statement up here, right, just a few verses before, when Isaac is blessing Jacob and he says, V'yiten lecha ha'elokim mital hashamayim umishmanei haaretz. So this is very subtle, which is fine. There really is only a very small difference, at least in this part. The blessings go on and diverge in certain ways, but as it regards the fat of the land, both brothers are blessed with the fat of the land. And yet, the blessing to Jacob begins with the word v'yiten, which means, and it's translated here, and may God give. Yiten lecha Elokim, may God give. V'yiten. The vav there, vi, right, means and. And lots of commentators pick up on this letter, basically, and are curious about what it is serving as a conjunction between, or why does it seem to start mid-sentence? Now, I'll just say a little secret is that, like, so do a lot of verses in the Torah begin with the letter Vav. Vayomer Hashem, God said, and this, right, Vayivrav. The Vav is a very common letter to start a sentence or to start a verse in the Torah. So putting aside the mere fact that it is not all that anomalous, it nevertheless becomes an occasion for a lot of commentary. And I'm going to just draw your attention here, and then we'll come to the actual Sfat Emet. Okay, so here's what Rashi says on this opening phrase of v'yiten, and we're only going to look at the first 3 words, which are quoted from the Midrash in Breshit Rabbah. V'yiten lecha, he says, yiten v'yachzor v'yiten. May he give thee and give thee repeatedly. Very, elevated language there. But may God give you and give you again. The suggestion being that the Vav there is actually not a conjunction per se with what came before, but is an indication of continuity, essentially. And God will give, and then God will give again, and God will give again, and God will give again. And this continuity of blessing is really the focus of the Sfat Emet this week. And he claims that it is the continuity of blessing itself that is actually, to some degree, the content of blessing. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. So now we're going to go up here. I hope I'm not making you dizzy with that. I'm sorry. Here we go. So we have the Sfat Emet, Toldot 1881. And he says the following: B'pasuk v'yiten lecha v'yachzor v'yiten. That's just what we just read. Perush. Sheken derech hatzadik she'ino chafetz limalot beito kesef v'zahav. He says, this is the way of the righteous who do not desire to fill their home with silver and gold. This is the way of the righteous who do not desire to fill their home with silver and gold. I'm going to stop this for a moment so I can see some faces. Okay. So this is a bit enigmatic as an opening, and I think doesn't quite announce itself or the meaning of it. But here's what I'm going to suggest. The statement is not that righteous people are ascetics. It is not that righteous people, eschew all money or possessions, but is actually about acquisition itself, or rather accumulation. The key word here is limalot, which means to fill up. And the claim is that righteous people do not, and there's an extra word here, chafetz limalot, which means they don't even desire to fill up on gold and silver. Meaning, there's nothing wrong with gold and silver in and of itself, but an overabundance of it is somehow discontinuous with righteousness. We don't yet know how or why that is. But this seems to be the mashal, or the image that he's bringing forth. That when it comes to particularly gold and silver, which we'll say here is a kind of stand-in for blessing, the righteous people don't want it all at once. They want it piecemeal. And the question, I suppose, is why? And is that in and of itself, the piecemeal nature of blessing, is that part of the blessing? So I'm going to continue. Hold on. Sorry. Okay. He says, I'm over here. Rak zot habracha, shashem yitbarach yiten lo b'chol et hatzarich lo. He says, this is the blessing itself. Now we're coming to the blessing given from Isaac to Jacob is Hashem yitbarach, God will give to him, to Jacob, everything that he needs in its time. Yiten lo b'chol et hatzarich lo. Everything that he needs in that particular moment, right? So if we think about the house full of gold and silver, right? He will not be gifted with like an infinite bank account, let's say, right? But rather, when he has needs, he'll be able to fill them, or he will have them filled. He'll have just enough money that he needs, let's say, or put differently, let's get out of the monetary images for a moment, right? Let's go with food, right? For reasons that will become clear in a moment, right? He will not be gifted with storehouses of food, but rather when he's hungry, his hunger will be met each and every time. And he goes on to say, quoting the Zohar, Lachen Mairi din mehemnuta. This is Aramaic because the Zohar is largely that. The masters of faith. He says, for this reason, masters of faith mitzpalalin b'chol yoma al mizona, k'moshe katuv b'zohar kadosh. This is why masters of faith pray every day for their food. I'm going to stop right there. Okay. So this is why the masters of faith pray every day for their food. The masters of faith in kind of the land of the Zohar, right, are some pretty wise people, right? They're people who really deeply understand, right, the Kabbalistic esoterica, right? They really have a pretty close relationship with God and some deep understandings with God. And so it's a bit counterintuitive, one might think, to say that those who have the most faith are those precisely who do not rest on faith alone, or those who have great faith do not actually assume God's blessings, right? The sort of famous statement of God will provide, that's what doesn't come out of the mouth of the master of faith. I'm going to say that again because that's a little bit strange, right? God will provide is precisely not what a master of faith says, but rather a master of faith is one who prays for their food every single day. And I want to sort of put out there a little bit, maybe you can put it in the chat, or we can take maybe just a few comments in the beginning here to think about why that might be, why it is a position of righteousness to not assume God's grace, let's say, but to actually ask for it day in and day out. Thoughts? Anybody? If you prefer, I can keep talking, but I just thought this was a...
it says many times that that when we get fat, we will get lazy and not be grateful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's important to keep that mindfulness every day that, mm-hmm. that our food is a gift.
Right.
Comes to us, that we should be great. It should come to us with gratitude, not with expectation or...
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Beautiful. Right. So Laura Rotter says, build your relationship with God. Yeah. Janet, go ahead. Janet Derrick.
I was going to say basically the same thing. It keeps us in communication with God daily.
Okay.
And
great.
Keeps that connection.
Yes. All right, great. So I'm happy that was pretty intuitive for you. So let me just say a couple of things about that. It does seem, as you're already suggesting, right, that the way of the righteous, if we could put it that, right, is precisely one that sustains and maintains a relationship with God, or frankly, with dependence itself. There's a way in which awareness of lack, awareness of what we can't provide for ourselves is itself an opening, right, to seek it elsewhere. So on the sort of grand scale here as presented, we can farm, let's say, right, but we can't actually make those crops grow. Someone here referenced that that idea as represented by sort of one of the concerns about entering the land of Israel is precisely that a person might think, oh my gosh, look what I've done this all by myself. But we are reminded over and over again that even that which does seem like it is already there, the house seems like it's already full of gold and silver. Actually, the truth of the matter is, right, we are always vulnerable, and the gold and the silver could go away, and the full fridge can go away. And I think that while it's not necessarily a happy reflection, I do think that living through COVID times has been a very contemporary direct experience of the ways in which things that we have, taken for granted disappear, whether it be toilet paper or our health, right? Those are obviously two extremes. But there is a kind of there's a desire to keep that fragility or vulnerability front and center, not to make us feel bad or insecure, but actually to consistently, it was said beautifully before, I think it was Devora who said, right, to keep, I'm going to get it wrong, forgive me, but to keep the relationship with God alive with gratitude, as opposed to expectation. I hope I said that correctly. That's exactly the idea here, right? And so when we imagine, or when the Sfas Emes imagines that it's the masters of faith who are precisely the ones who don't take God for granted, or who don't take sustenance specifically, right? Food, who don't take sustenance for granted, it is they, right, who live with a constant gratitude of receiving, right? There's no expectation. There's only the gift of receiving for as long as that lasts.
Entitlement was the word I was looking for.
Okay. I like expectation though, but entitlement also works. Yes. Thank you. As an example of this, I wanted to share with you, it's not directly in the Sfat Emet, but thinking about food, I wanted to just bring the following to your attention, which is that in the grace after meals, AKA benching, as we say in my world, there is, right, the first blessing is, or ends with Hazan et Hakol, God who gives food to all. And I always thought it's a really interesting tidbit to kind of pair that with the kind of history that is written about it in the Talmud, if you could call it history, or the backstory that is attributed to it in the Talmud. And in source 4, from Brachot 48b, you can see Amar Rav Nachman Moshe tiken liYisrael birchat Hazan b'sha'ah sheyarad lahem Haman. Right, that Moshe established or instituted this blessing, and particularly Hazan et Hakol, God who gives food to everybody, precisely during the time that the manna fell from the sky. And I find that interesting because manna falling from the sky is the exact opposite of right, a bird in the basket. Is that the right phrase, right? Or the house full of gold and silver. Manna falling from heaven is the actual training, I would say, of the Jewish people into the kind of mindset that we've been talking about. The reason for that is because man itself came with all kinds of rules and regulations. So just as a reminder, right, man is this kind of magical stuff that falls from the heavens. We don't really know what it is. Maybe it tasted like anything you wanted it to taste like. There are all kinds of, midrashim and stories about what it might have been. But it was a way for the people in the desert to be fed, right, literally from the heavens. But some of the rules and regulations involved who could collect, when they could collect, how much they could collect, on what days they could collect. And one very important detail is that there are no leftovers, except for on Shabbat. This is food that rots overnight. It cannot be saved for the next day, which means that every single night, right, the Jewish people in the desert, so long as they were being fed by man, went to bed not knowing for sure if they would have food to eat in the morning, right? Except for Friday night, right? Because they were able to gather for Shabbat. Okay, but every other day was an exercise in a kind of literalization of this notion of praying for food, right? They had to pray for food every night, or just hope for food, or right. Certainly they were not entitled to food, and they certainly did not have, right, a refrigerator full for next morning's breakfast. They actually would go to sleep not knowing if they would be fed, their children would be fed, the people they love would be fed. They really didn't know, but they had to trust. And so I find it kind of a really interesting kind of, I don't know, there's something subtle to me about Moshe, on the one hand, referring to God as the God who nurtures all, which does suggest a kind of abundance and plenty, but asking people to sort of cultivate that awareness, right, at the same time as they cultivate this day in and day out gratitude for that which is not certain. Meaning, could they actually somehow believe in their capacity to be nourished? Or said differently, if we externalize it, could they believe in a God who would nourish all and at the same time not take for granted that that God would actually feed them every single day? And so this man, I think, became a kind of training ground for how one ought to eat, right? Or how one ought to feel nourished in the world. On the one hand, for there to be some kind of baseline trust in our, hopefully, ability to be nourished. And at the same time, right, as was said before, not taking for granted that that will happen, so that there will be gratitude each and every time, and awareness of the gift of it each and every time. So coming back now to the Sfat Emet on the bracha, right? Yiten v'yachzor v'yiten. He says is the blessing that Jacob, right, should be a recipient of man, essentially, right? That Jacob should be somebody who is hopefully blessed by the one who, gives to all, but actually doesn't have the security to assume that, but rather is in constant communication with a God so that he can experience his own need, so that his relationship with God can continue to be built again and again and again. And so to see this in the language of the Sfat Emet, he compares this, I'm over here now, if you can see that, to the bracha given to Esav. So we started in the beginning by noticing this very slight difference between the bracha given to Yaakov and the bracha given to Esav. Jacob's blessing starts with the words v'yiten lecha, and Esav's includes this very small difference, hine, like behold, mishmanei ha'aretz yihiyeh moshavecha, right? You will have it all, essentially, right? And it's a bit unusual maybe to imagine that the lesser blessing is to have it all, but that is the claim being made here, I think. So he says, "Bibirkat Esav k'tiv mishmanei ha'aretz yihiyeh moshavecha," right? It'll be in your midst. For Esav, the fat of the land will be there for him. Aval b'Yaakov k'tiv, I'm here. I'm gonna make that clear. Okay. Aval b'Yaakov k'tiv vayiten sheyesh lo hitchadshut hashif'a b'chol yom, which means, right, for Yaakov, who is the receiver of this continuous blessing, v'yiten lecha, he says, sheyesh lo hitchadshut. So Yaakov will have a sense of renewal every day. This word shif'a comes from the word shafa, which is a kind of Kabbalistic term that means the divine flow. And so what happens when one taps into the experience or the feeling of kind of insufficiency, right, is that there's something else, someone else that can come and fill that. And then we can then experience shafa. We can experience divine flow or goodness. We can be on the receiving end of that. And he says that's a blessing. Right? And this is the way he says that God renews every day the work of creation. Sorry, I see that I didn't put the direct quotation or the citation there rather, but I think it's also from Psalms, that God, what does it mean that God is mechadesh, God renews? It means that each and every day we have the opportunity to experience renewal through this opening towards, again, receiving, everyday receiving. And he says, "Umizah hitchadshut notel haboteach b'Hashem v'kach katuv einei kol elecha yisaveru ve'ata noten lahem etz achlam bi'ito." Another verse from Psalms, the eyes all look to you expectantly, and you give them their food when it is due, be'ito, or in its time. Again, again, coming back to this image of food coming piece by piece, or right as a response to hunger and not in anticipation of it. And so let me remove that and just stop there for a moment. Yeah, to think a little bit with you about this, about the ways in which need might itself be either a blessing or an opening toward a blessing. I'm reflecting a little bit on a podcast I recently heard from Antonio Damasio, who's like a philosopher and just Renaissance man, right, who talks about the importance of human feelings of need in a very kind of biological way, right? How, we might think that wouldn't it be great if we could, let's say, feel no pain, for example, right? But actually people who can't feel any pain really live with tremendous threat because they can't anticipate danger, right? Or, well, it would be great maybe if we never experienced hunger, but we actually might go, we might become undernourished, or God forbid, right, lose our energy or our lives because we can't feed ourselves. Similarly, he expands it to kind of emotional life as it relates to connection. And here too is something that I hope resonates maybe during these times, or certainly what we have been through in terms of isolation and quarantine, right? That we're not always in touch with our deep need for others, lowercase o, uppercase O, right? We're not always in touch with that, right? Until it's gone, until we are in our homes and we can't be with our loved ones, and we, right, are maybe stuck in these boxes. Sorry, that's background noise. I apologize. I hope it'll stop in a moment. So sometimes when we get in touch with our need, it actually becomes an opening to cultivate relationship again. And it's that dynamic on a kind of spiritual level that the Sfat Emet is suggesting undergirds Jacob's blessing. It's a blessing of a kind of insufficiency, the recognition of that, so that he might reach out and so that he might receive, right? So he might open himself up and have the gratitude for having received. I'm going to stop mostly because it's loud. So I'm going to give you a chance to speak for a moment, hoping that it'll go away, and get back together in a moment. Somebody want to respond to that or ask a question? Okay, go ahead, Devorah.
Sorry, I have so many thoughts about this. Well, it reminds me of two things. One is that I think that there have been studies that people who starve during wars live a long time. If they survive, that they live a long time. Their body has some sort of immune response to the starvation that makes their immune system stronger. But also it reminds me that we are so used to getting things in grocery stores packaged and are so far from being agricultural that every day a farmer must appreciate whether the timing of the weather is right. Whereas for us, it's like, there's no milk in the store. What's with that? Or we can't get strawberries in the winter, or what, that's a shanda. and so the difference in being in touch with the land and the sky and weather, and being grateful every day, as opposed to being entitled and just going to the grocery store and it's full of stuff. I mean, that really woke us up this past year. Right. That didn't happen all the time. Yeah. And yet still we were in very good shape that way. Many of us were, some of us were not. Yes.
Understood. It calls to mind something that is a distinction also that the Torah makes between life in the land of Egypt and life in the land of Israel. Or I'll say that the rabbis interpret it in the following way, that there's a statement that, the land of Israel is a land that, God's eyes are on, Einei Hashem Eleha Tamid, or something like that. And one of the interpretations of that, not just that Israel's like a super holy place, but actually from an agricultural standpoint, I don't know if this is entirely true, but here's what I have kind of imbibed, is that Egypt, the experience of Egypt for our ancestors was an experience, right, leaving oppression aside. Let's say it this way, Egyptian culture relied on the Nile. And the Nile was a plentiful river which overflowed often and would feed the crops, presumably. And the land of Israel was and is largely barren, right? Or is largely desert. And so this kind of rabbinic interpretation is that to live in the land of Israel is to put oneself in a position of greater dependence. Quite literally, one has to kind of look skyward in the way of the man falling, right? One has to look skyward to see if, right, will the rain come? Will we have crops? Will we be fed? Which is very different from, again, in a very spatial way, right? Looking up versus looking down in the Nile. That seems to be a kind of reliable source. And I want to recognize the sort of the privilege that it takes to actually, romanticize or spiritualize need when there's so many people whose needs can't be filled, and all the spirit in the world won't help their bellies be full. So I want to recognize that, and also kind of take seriously this idea that there is some kind of spiritual utility that is granted, right? Not in deprivation, right? This is why I distinguished in that mashal, in that image of the person with a house full of gold and silver, right? It was specifically about the accumulation, right? This is not a claim that it is bad to have money, or it's bad to be fed, or anything of the sort. Right? It's precisely about the kind of pace of accumulation and acquisition, such that one loses touch with one's own needs, right? And so, sorry, that was a long way of saying that, yes, when we have, when we go shopping in a grocery store only, we might lose touch with that. That might be more of an Egypt experience than an Israel experience, kind of mythically understood. But sometimes we are reminded, right? Whether it's the strawberries that aren't there, the toilet paper that isn't on the shelves, right? The supply chains that are disrupted. I know these are like relatively small problems, but they are reminders that we aren't always reliably, fed in all the ways that we might want to be, and we have to rely on other people. And kind of other forces, I would say. Okay. Other questions or comments? Go ahead, Janet.
Can you make more clear to me the distinction between the blessing that Jacob got and the blessing that Esau got? I can't quite see the distinction.
Well, it's good that you can see the distinction, because there really isn't very much at all. And this is an instance of making much of not a lot. So on a very literal level, here's the difference. With regard to Jacob, the words are v'yiten lecha. And with regard to Esav, it's hine, which means here it is, right? You have it already. Another difference might be this word moshavecha. So again, I can put this back up if that's helpful. Hold on. Okay, so this is the blessing to Jacob here. V'yiten lecha ha'elokim. V'yiten lecha Elokim mital hashamayim umishmanei haaretz v'rov dagan v'tirosh. It doesn't say where it's going, and it doesn't say, right, that, or presumably it doesn't say that it's all there. Versus down here, Hine mishmanei haaretz yihye moshavecha umital hashamayim me'al. The Sfat Emetz, I think, is honing in on the hine, like behold, it's there. Although he actually doesn't quote that word, so I can't say that with certainty. But also yihye moshavecha, which sounds like, again, coming back to the analogy of the person's house, right? It's going to be within your abode. You're going to have it already. The fat of the land will be yours, right? Presumably your refrigerators will be full. Your storehouses will be, up to capacity. That is the difference. And it's, as I said before, like that is an interesting claim that would be the lesser blessing.
Okay, so let me just make sure I understand. So that Isaac, he already has it all. But Jacob's, it's going to be coming out in little pieces as needed.
Yeah, but it's Esav, not Isaac.
Right. I mean, sorry.
Right. Yes. So Esav will have it all.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Esau. Right. But Jacob's comes in as needed.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, one other question I have is, in the first part, Jacob says, God will give this to you.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you showed us the part from Esau, it's like the blessing is coming from his father.
That's a great point. That's a really great point. Beautiful. Thank you. Okay, great. So
I don't know.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Let's notice, right, that with regard to the blessing to Jacob, the verse does say, Yiten lecha ha'elokim, God will give you, as opposed to the blessing to Esav, which has this like, behold, it's just there. Hine mishmanei haaretz yihye moshavecha. Like, yes, it doesn't actually say God. And I think that's kind of interesting. It also, not kind of interesting, that is interesting. And that's very observant of you. So thank you. I bristle at the kind of reception of the characters of Jacob and Esau, where Jacob becomes this like perfect character. Jacob, who deceives his father, somehow becomes a perfect character, and Esau becomes like the kind of container of all things evil. So I bristle at that because I don't think actually the text indicates that Esau isn't all bad, and certainly Yaakov isn't all good. But in line with that kind of thinking, I will say to you that one way of interpreting precisely what you just brought up, Janet, right, is that the blessing to Esau is a physical blessing, and the blessing to Jacob is a more spiritual blessing, right? That is sort of one way to read this distinction, and to understand maybe why, how these blessings, so similar, also might contain these kind of small differences that indicate maybe expectations about who they are and what kind of people they will be. Though I, again, don't want to put down Esav.
Well, along these same lines, though, can you speak to, wasn't this blessing the whole thing about giving the birthright or something to the oldest son, which then was tricked? So what is giving a birthright different from giving a blessing? Is there something about, or am I not?
Yeah, no, you're right. I think I don't want to totally go down that path, but yeah, you're absolutely right that there's other levels of kind of dynamics between these brothers and arguments over birthright / blessing. Right. Some of it has to do with inheritance, Janet. But okay, let's move on. Sorry, but thank you. Sheila, go ahead. You're still on mute. Try again. Oh, maybe here it says, oh, sorry, is it me? It says ask to unmute. Are you getting a D? Can you help out here? Oh,
I got it.
There you go. Yay.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. So it seems to me that the difference in the two blessings may have to do with focusing on the blessing to Yaakov, may have to do with the mission of Am Yisrael, which we we read over and over again requires reaching out to the stranger and the oppressed.
Nice.
Other texts about, being mindful of others who are hungry.
Mhm.
So our daily experience of an awareness of
Yes.
dependency and having to depend on and also appreciate, live by God's compassion,
Mhm.
teaches us about human needs and teaches us how to be
Beautiful.
sensitive to that and to emulate God, right?
Mhm.
To follow in God's ways.
I appreciate that very much, Sheila, because I think what you're kind of wringing out of this text is the kind of ethical imperative that comes with this, which isn't necessarily so obvious. Here we are talking about sort of relationship and reaching out and being the receiver of gifts. But what I hear you saying is, in order to be a giver of gifts, in order to be generous to other people, it also helps to tap into the ways in which we ourselves are needful people, and of necessity, because we're human. And it helps to awaken us to need around us. So I think that's really beautiful. So thank you. Ilana, go ahead.
Thank you. So along the lines of awareness, I'm thinking of this again, these words that Janet was asking about, hine and vayiten, and I'm wondering if hine, is it like, here, you already have it, it's already here, you have all the blessings, but the tragedy of Esau is that he's not aware of it. And this is what we see when he already has the blessing and he, wants to throw it away for, a cup of soup. It's just that he's suffering from this lack of awareness, and maybe that's a paradigm for us, rather than that he's evil and wicked, but a paradigm as a warning. Whereas Jacob Vayiten, who doesn't have everything yet, or not the way he was hoping, but he's going to be blessed with growing awareness. And there's that theme of addition and adding abundance all the time. And so then we have two different paradigms of just the awareness of Shefa and blessing in our world, that we can look at these two personalities as.
I think that's great. And I think it's consistent with what we, this is just like the beginning of Jacob's journey, right? By next week, he's going to be, wrestling with angels, and there's all kinds of struggles ahead. And so he certainly doesn't have it all, right? He's someone who will keep needing to search it out for the rest of his life, right? Much later on, he'll have lots of other complications with his children, right? He's a very complicated character. So maybe I'm reading a little bit more into what you said, but I appreciate it because I do think it speaks to, a person who keeps needing to grow and revisit and maybe undo some things. There's nothing static about him. He is, definitely a person in process. And I think that is here presented as its own form of blessing. Right. And we've seen that in the Sfat Emet before too, that he is all about movement. I don't know if you can remember back to Lech Lecha, movement there, just the importance of being one who moves in and of itself. It's a theme that he very much focuses on, as well as the theme of hitchadshut, or renewal. That is a crucial kind of spiritual value to him. And I think he sees this as an instrument toward renewal, right? That we can only open ourselves to newness, change, and again, receiving from the outside when we can recognize our own deficiencies inside. So thank you for that. I think I'm going to say one more thing and then welcome other people's comments or questions. We've been talking about this because the Sfat Emet pointed us in this direction through the kind of lens of food a lot, and kind of extrapolating to relationship, sort of hunger for other. And I guess I would just kind of invite us to think about this not only in terms of kind of spiritual yearning for spiritual relationships, but also for relationships with one another. And we, I'd said before that maybe this was one of the things that came out of COVID is a greater sense of need for connection and a greater sense of need for other. I think that hopefully pertains not only to those like outside of our households, but also right inside, right? Such that we don't consider our own homes to be storehouses of plenty, but actually spaces where there's a kind of constancy of need for renewal and rejuvenation with partners, children, whoever it is that populates our lives. And so I think that, right, we started a moment ago talking about like Jacob as a character and who he's going to become. So really appreciate Ilana, I think that was you who raised it. And I do think that Jacob becomes this paradigm almost, right, of, I suppose he's not alone in this, but he's got some pretty unresolved relationships. This is the kind of beginning of one, right? This grand deception will be a moment of great like disequilibrium, to say the least, in his household, that he will then literally spend a lifetime trying to even out. And so his own awareness of his need for his brother, ultimately, his own need for home and rootedness, right? Because here he's going to be leaving home. That too will become a kind of trope for him of trying to find his way home, and trying to find, resolved relationships. There's a midrash that suggests that the ultimate distance between him and his son, his beloved son Joseph, was itself a kind of response for, punishment for, maybe tikkun or resolution of the amount of time that he separated from his family on account of this moment, on account of this deception, right? He ran away, and in so doing, right, he saved his life, but he also fractured his relationships with certainly his brother, but also his parents that he didn't see for a long time. And so we have this image, right, of a character very much in formation, certainly doesn't have it all. And it's sort of a lovely and provocative thing to say that at this moment, the blessing to him is to not have it all and to recognize how that in and of itself allows one to be filled and filled again and filled again and filled again. And that keeps relationships live, the recognition of the need for the other. Okay, I'll stop there. Miriam Seelig, go ahead.
He was deceived, he deceived his brother, but he also was deceived by Lavan. He had to work him 14 years just for Rachel that he loved.
Right.
And also, but also on the other hand, he also continued the line of Abraham from him, not Esav, but Esau, but him. So I just want to add to that.
For sure, right? And to think that the kind of the legacy, right? The legacy that we as the kind of, late descendants, right? B'nai Yisrael, the children of Yisrael or Jacob, right? That means that this blessing is something for all of us to see as part of our kind of spiritual, endowment in a way. Right, which is to live our lives not with the kind of complacence of satisfaction or satiety, right? But actually tapping into the ways in which we are hungry and we do have needs and we do need connections and we do need help, and how that itself can be a real spiritual value as opposed to an impediment to the spiritual life. Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in? Can't see all of you, so you have to either raise your hand or jump in if you want. Otherwise, I'll say one more thing. Okay. Okay, so just one final word on this, and that is that there's a small statement here that I didn't focus on because it's complicated, but since we have a few extra minutes, I'll just add it in here. The Sfat Emet says, "Umizeh hahitchadshut notel haboteach b'Hashem." I can put that up for a second. Okay, it's these words right here. I'll take these ones away. Playing with my new toys here. Okay, and I will tell you that I had a very difficult time translating these words. Here's what I came up with. Let's see if I can find it here. The one who has faith in God draws or takes from this renewal. I will highlight that as well. Okay, the one who has faith in God, haboteach b'Hashem, draws from, or notel is to take, right? Takes from this renewal. And so I think that there's this interesting, almost v'yiten of its own, meaning that there's a kind of continuity of blessing that this continuity of giving itself sets into motion. The suggestion is that, that when one lives in this way, which is to say, right, constant gratitude without expectation or entitlement, as was said before, right, it actually becomes a kind of well that can feed a person's soul, right? And so there's a way in which it's, I know this sounds cliche, but it's a gift that keeps on giving, right? Because that awareness of need, which yields a renewal, is self-perpetuating, essentially. And one who has faith, or one who is kind of spiritually practiced, the Mayri de Menehemna, the masters of faith, in a certain sense, right, have their faith renewed precisely on account of their not taking faith for granted, right? And so there's this virtuous circle, not vicious cycle, but virtuous circle, where not having allows one to have more, let's say, or not taking for granted, right, opens up a kind of portal for a constant cycle of gratitude. And so I think that it's kind of a beautiful place for us to even, to draw to a close, but specifically to, to focus on this parsha, this complicated parsha that involves deception and everyone's needs not being met, right? With Esav saying, "Hi, what about me? My needs aren't being met," right? And the Sfat Emet gives us this overlay that helps to give kind of, again, a kind of spiritual value to those moments and to those experiences of needs not yet being met, in the ways that it opens us up to what might be coming. Okay, so with that, I will ask if there are any final questions or comments or disagreements. Anyone? Okay, so we'll close just a few minutes early then. Thank you, everyone.